Hello and welcome to Pleasure Reading. I'm your host, Amelia, and this is a podcast about the pleasure of reading, where I share curated reading lists, author rankings, chats with my bookish friends, and more. If you too take pleasure in reading, I hope that you will subscribe and share this show with a friend. Cheers to your next best book. Hello, and welcome to Pleasure Reading. I'm Amelia, and on this podcast, I share curated book lists on a variety of themes, as well as occasional conversations with my favorite bookish friends. If you're an astute listener, you may have noticed that it has been, I think, over 2 months since our last episode. And that was for many reasons. A lot of stuff was happening in my personal life, but one of those reasons was also that in May, I hit a reading slump. Now, do I think reading slumps are a real thing? I'm not so sure. I feel like they're very overhyped in the bookish community, or they tie our reading to productivity in a way I don't like. I want to be on the record to say that I think it's super normal to not read a book for weeks or months or maybe even years, and we don't have to call that a slump. I think reading slumps can be defined by our personal relationships to reading. So for me, there were almost 4 weeks in May where I did not read a single book. I don't even think I read part of a book because I couldn't get interested in anything that I picked up. And that is extremely abnormal for me. So I'm calling it a reading slump. And the way I finally moved out of that was that over Memorial Day weekend, I did a bit of mood reading. So what is mood reading? Well, today I am joined by a very wonderful guest to talk about mood reading, reading based on the vibe, and how we find books that suit our very specific moods. Let me introduce you to my guest, and then we'll dive in. Rachel Ropeik is a cultural catalyst and pirate who works with equal parts wisdom and whimsy. From navigating the halls of the Guggenheim, the Brooklyn Museum, MoMA, and more, to setting sail as a consultant changemaker, she blends thoughtful disruption and playful innovation in work with both cultural organizations and individuals. Rachel guides people towards surprise, equity, and productive encounters with the edges of their comfort zones. She leads adaptively, empathetically, and with refreshing directness and humor. Rachel is many kinds of nerd, fueling her work with omnivorous reading, dancing, baking, and global adventures. Antarctica is her only unvisited continent for now. And today on the podcast, Rachel and I are going to talk about a few things. So we're going to share some books we love and the exact mood that they are perfect for. We're going to talk about how we find books and where we get book recommendations when we both don't really use social media. And we're going to talk a tiny bit about how we approach the books we're not enjoying and when we DNF or just put a book down and don't finish it. So I'm super excited for this conversation. Hi, Rachel. Welcome to Pleasure Reading.
Hi, Amelia. Thank you. I feel like mood reading is the only way that I read. So I'm really excited to get into this with you.
Yes. So as a bit of backstory, you and I know each other from some online business things, and you sent me a really lovely email a few months ago now, essentially saying, in my own words, Amelia, I also love to read, and I'm noticing that I do not read based on curated lists and projects like you do. Would you want to talk about that for the podcast? And I was like, let's do it. So I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about what does mood reading mean to you? Because I don't even think you used that phrase when you reached out to me.
No, I think it was your phrase, but I really like it. I feel like it is a really good phrase to encapsulate the way that I read. So I think, as you said in my bio, and I say to people many times, I feel like I'm many kinds of nerd, which means I read a lot of weird, random books, nonfiction, fiction, all different genres. For a while, I was trying to read a book in French every so often to not get totally rusty. That's fallen off. But if you look at my bookshelf, it's here are nerdy academic press, deep academia nerd books about, at the moment, it's a lot of pirate nerd books, but it's been a bunch of things. And then it's oh my God, what's the new romance novel that I can read in 3 seconds and just be immersed in that world, and everything in between. And I would also say that part of mood reading for me is when I've finished a book, what mood am I in for the next one? So it's a little bit what mood that book has left me in. And then, do I want to stay in that mood? Do I want a really different mood? Do I want like a new mood, to stay in that family? It was really interesting to think about it in that way, that I'm not necessarily always kind of picking a mood first and then picking a book to meet it, but I am thinking about what mood am I in? What kind of book do I want for that mood?
Yeah, I definitely think that I often similarly like reverse engineer the mood sort of, or it's like I might pick up a few things and then I realize like, oh, this is it right now because I'm feeling this way.
I would also say that I think sometimes, I guess this isn't even mood. I don't know what the term for this is. It's like library waitlist reading.
The mood is Libby.
Exactly, right? It's the mood is what is available. I get a lot of stuff from the library. I actually try to only buy books that I've already read that I might want to read again, because I have a tendency to buy books anyway, and so that's a helpful limit. And so I'll try to get it from the library, and a lot of times that means that what I'm reading next depends on what is available from the library.
Absolutely. I'm definitely really motivated by books being due back to the library. And most often, like I am much more likely to read a book I got from the library than a book I bought because once it's on my shelf, it'll just be there forever. So I can just read it whenever I want. And somehow that means I never read it. It's like this really broken conundrum. It's kind of like if I buy a book, either I'm going to read it within 72 hours of it entering the house, or it's going to take me like 2 years to actually read it.
Yeah. I think you did an episode that was like wanting to read books that you already own. That was very relatable, Amelia.
Yeah. And now that I'm saying this, I'm like, this is hilarious because of the books I'm going to talk about today, 2 were from the library and 1 is a book that I bought and read within 24 hours of bringing it into my house. So the habits are still the same. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the books that we wanted to share. And the idea I had for this essentially was that we would each bring like 3 books and talk about like the mood that they are perfect for, or the mood we were in that got us to read them. So I'm going to share 3 books that kind of helped me get out of my reading slump in different ways because they suited different aspects of the mood that was keeping me from reading. And I know you're also going to share 3 books that you've read recently and what mood brought you to them. So I'd love to pass it to you first. Could you tell us about your first book?
Sure. So the first one that I will say, which I just finished recently, is The Antidote by Karen Russell. Kind of magical realism in relatively modern and contemporary times. That's kind of the vibe that she gives. And The Antidote, it's set in the Dust Bowl.
In Nebraska, right? It's not where I live. That's the only reason I've heard of this book.
It is Amelia's hometown. Well, not your hometown, but your home state. So it's set in the Dust Bowl in the middle of America. And it does have a magical realism element because one of the main characters that you follow through is a prairie witch, which is a type of person that goes around to mostly small towns. And in essence, the townspeople can go and pay the prairie witch to confess a memory, which could be a positive memory or a negative memory. And then the person who has that memory no longer remembers it. And the idea with the prairie witch is that the prairie witch's magic means that they don't know the memory, but they hold the memory. So they're kind of holding it in their body without being consciously aware of it. And then the customer can come back at some future point and withdraw their deposit. And they're talked about as vaults. So there's this really interesting kind of idea about like what do traumatic memories do to our bodies and how we consciously remember or don't. And then there's the whole plot line about like a teenage girl who is playing girls basketball, which was like a real thing that was happening at the time. And that's going on at the same time. And there's also a whole storyline about kind of how did these mostly European white immigrants come to be farming in the middle of the country in such a way that the soil is no longer holding onto plants and they've run into the Dust Bowl. And so it also deals with some of the historical American ugliness of pushing indigenous people off their lands, of not using healthy farming techniques, of wanting to push down ugly memories. So it encapsulates a lot. And I feel like the mood that I would put to it, which I think I kind of applied retrospectively because I read it when it was available from the library. So, but I would say that the mood is sort of like, do you want a book that is like both magical realism and dealing with the realities of American history? And this does it in a really nice way. Like there are some fun plot lines and some interesting plot lines, and you learn about history, and there's also some really deep and dark, troubling plot lines. And it was sort of like a really nice mix. And I loved the way that it used the sort of magical realism element to be part of that.
That's so interesting. Well, I'm immediately now like running to my library holds to actually read it. I had seen it come out. I saw it was set in Nebraska, and then it just kind of like passed me by in the sea of books.
Yeah, it was really good. Karen Russell, The Antidote.
This definitely sounds like the mood is like Midwestern historical magic.
It's like Midwestern historical magic plus trauma.
It was also, the way you're describing it really reminded me of The Deep by River Solomon, because that book is set in a very different place underwater, but the general sense of like there's one member of a community who holds all of the memory and has to live with all of the trauma. And then in that book, there's sort of like an annual event where the memories are shared among the community and everyone has to feel it and live it. And then they're all given back to that one person. So essentially, like, the people can just go through their lives and feel okay, but this one person holds all the memories. That feels sort of like the vault concept.
Yes. It also reminded me a little bit of The Giver by Lois Lowry, which I loved when I was younger, which is still worth a reread. I've reread it as an adult, and it's great.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful, like, sort of constellation of books that we've pulled together there. And yes, I will definitely be reading The Antidote by Karen Russell. Thank you. Okay. For my first share, I'm going to totally change the mood. And I think I'm going to cheat a little bit because it's kind of two books. But when I was like really deep in that reading slump and I was like, I don't like anything. For me, that's when I really turned to genre fiction, because I'm like, okay, when I feel like I am not enjoying my reading, I don't have the energy or the attention to spend that much time building a new world. I want a book that's going to give me that like immediate payoff, that immediate good feeling. And for me, those are always going to be thrillers or romance. Like those are my two genres where I go for that sort of like easy reading. Even though some of those books are about like really complex topics, it's not that they're quote unquote easy books, but I can get into them easier myself. So my first recommendation for the mood is Problematic Summer Romance by Ali Hazelwood. So this is her brand new book. It just came out, and it's the second book in a series. That's another way I motivate myself. And if I'm in a sort of slump, if I can like go to a series I already enjoyed, that sort of pulls me through. So the mood I was in before I read this book was like, I hate everything, and I don't know if I like books anymore. So I read Problematic Summer Romance by Ali Hazelwood. And this is an age gap romance. It's the first age gap romance that Ali Hazelwood has written. She became famous for writing what they called STEMinist romance, which was like women in STEM feminist romance. She became famous for those. And then she sort of shifted her purview a little bit. So she wrote a book called Not in Love that was sort of set at a tech company and was more of an erotic romance than her other books have been. And this book follows that book, and it tells the story of this romance between Maya, who is 23, and Connor, who is 38, and is one of her older brother's best friends and business partners, and how they become friends and then build a relationship, and then like how they try to avoid that because of the problematic age gap. But they end up at a wedding, I think in Italy or in Tuscany or Sicily or something like that in the summer, and what happens and unfolds there. So I am not always a fan of an age gap. I'm actually pretty skeptical about age gap romances, especially like so many of them are like teacher-student dynamics that I really don't like. That's like a big ick for me personally. But I trust Ali Hazelwood so implicitly with how she writes and how she constructs characters and intimacy in her books. And I loved Problematic Summer Romance. It totally worked for me. There was like a lot of care paid to like how this age gap came to be, what happens, and not only the relationship between the two main characters, but all the people around them, and how there was a sort of like community support for true love. so, so that's all to say. I came to this book because I was just like not in the mood to read and I couldn't find anything I liked. But I think where it ended me, like the mood I left it with, was just this real sense of the many ways that intimacy and romance can come into our lives. And I just felt like fun and frilly by the end, I suppose, which did get me out of my reading slump a bit.
I feel like summer wedding in Italian countryside, you could put anything in there and I would probably enjoy it. And I do, it's funny as you were saying that, I think you have read, I will read a romance if it comes recommended. Absolutely. One of my good friends is all romance all the time. She's like an encyclopedia of romance. I'm not in any way down on romance. But I will say, I have not read that many of them overall. And I'm trying to think, are there any that are good where the age gap goes in the other direction? Like if it's a hetero couple where the woman is older and the man is younger. I don't know of any.
Yeah. I mean, I read and watched the movie for The Idea of You, which is like supposed to be Harry Styles fanfic.
I watched the movie. I did not read the book or the fanfic.
I read the book. I think actually the author is on record saying it's not about Harry Styles, but the general public 100% believes it is.
I'm one of the general public.
So I read that. And then I also know that Meryl Wilsner wrote a queer age gap between two women. And I think, I forget the name of that book. I'll put it in the show notes, but that sort of takes on this trope from a different perspective.
I'm going to take that cue to go for another queer romance, but it's different. I would not classify this as a romance novel, but it has a queer romance as a central plotline.
Great.
It's The Hymn to Dionysus by Natasha Pulley. And this one just came out this year. And Natasha Pulley has written other books, and I have loved them all. Anytime Natasha Pulley wants to write something new, I am there. She writes these historically set. They mostly have a queer romance element to them. Some of them have been connected. She wrote the first one that I read, which was kind of where I learned about her, is called The Watchmaker of Filigree Street. And it's about like England and Japan and kind of imperial times and how these two empires are kind of interacting with each other. Just very interesting. Also magical realism. Maybe this is a through line. I'm a sucker for magical realism. But The Hymn to Dionysus is like Dionysus, like it's set in ancient Greece. And the thing that I love so much, she has this tone to her writing that is always kind of like a very contemporary voice to it. So she's not like trying to write historical time periods where, it's trying to model the language, I guess. And so this is Phaedrus is the main character, and he is delightful. And he's from Thebes. And because I'm also an academic nerd about like the history of like men and queerness and menswear, that was part of what grad school was. The Theban band is interesting to me. This was sort of like the ancient Greek Theban soldiers where they had these very, very close, sometimes indeed lovers, although I don't think that was like required, bonds between age gap, older man and younger man.
Very Greek
and
of them.
Yeah, it was like the older man soldier who like trained the younger man from a very young age and then they had this really tight bond, and it was part of what made the Theban band kind of such fierce soldiers because they were all literally fighting with and for people that were very important to them. So Phaedrus is one of these people, and he's the main character, and he is basically dealing with kind of the city of Thebes kind of falling apart around him. Like the politics is messy. It's dealing with the queen of Thebes is kind of trying all these different things to maintain control. And at the same time, this new kind of mysterious witch comes to town. And the witch is basically Dionysus, the god of wine and revels. And this is also a book about like, if you bury all of your problems, they will come back and cause you trouble. And in this case, there's sort of Dionysus who comes to town, and through kind of like witchy supernatural means, people are trying to kind of express some of this inner wildness or inner kind of bacchanalia. And when the political situation of the time tries to squash that down, more problems happen. So Phaedrus and Dionysus are the couple that, it's not really a spoiler that they get together. It's in the summary. But it is really interesting to kind of see, again, I think it is a queer romance, and it has this very kind of contemporary tone to it and contemporary voice. And I also ended up learning more about ancient Greece and the different gods and symbolism and ritual traditions. And I would say the mood for this one is kind of like unhinged historical catharsis.
Whoa.
which I loved. The Hymn to Dionysus, Natasha Pulley, also anything else that Natasha Pulley has written, but I really enjoyed this one.
Wow. Okay. I love that mood. Unhinged historical catharsis. It's reminding me of another book that I'd imagine you've read that I have not read yet, which is The Song of Achilles.
Yes.
Does it feel in that same vein?
Yes, I would say Madeline Miller is another one. Anything she wrote, Song of Achilles, anything you want to read by Madeline Miller, wonderful. I would say Madeline Miller's books are a little bit more like straight down the middle, makes it sound like it's blah, and they're not blah, but they're more straightforwardly like, here is a historical retelling of this figure from Greek myths. Whereas I would say Natasha Pulley, and especially in this book, like she is kind of taking that as the jumping off point, but then she's inventing a lot more. I mean, she does a ton of research and she always talks about it in her afterword. But this one is the unhinged part is more Natasha Pulley than Madeline Miller.
Yeah, I would never describe Madeline Miller as unhinged on any level in her fiction, at least. It's also, if we want to go way more unhinged, the other thing it reminded me of was the Dark Olympus series by Katie Robert, which is essentially just like a smutty retelling of various Greek god stories, but set in more of like an urban fantasy setting. So the setup is that like there is Olympus and there's the underworld and there's the river Styx, but they're just like cities and they're just across the bridge from each other. And there's like, you know, all of the major pantheon of gods in Olympus, and there's some gods in the underworld, and then there are all of these very sexual relationships between various players. So the most recent one I read was Dionysus focused, so it reminded me of this.
I am running to put it on my to-read list this moment.
Okay, let me share another one of my mood reads. So the next book that I'm bringing to this episode is actually a book that I would have told you I was not in the mood for when I started reading it. But the reason I started reading it is because my local library every summer has this sort of like a book competition for what they call One Book, One Lincoln, which is where there's a committee that picks 10 books over the course of a year from a bunch of reader recommendations through the libraries. And then that committee reads the 10 books and they narrow it down to 3. And on Memorial Day, they have an event where they announce the 3 books of the summer. And then the city reads them and votes. And on Labor Day, they like tell us which one won with the most votes. And that's One Book, One Lincoln for the next year. So it's pretty common across many libraries, but that's how it's done here.
Libraries are the best.
All 3 books were announced on Memorial Day. It was James by Percival Everett, The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks Dalton, and Dust Child by Nguyen Phan Ke May. And I started with The Light Pirate. That was my first pick. And this is a literary fiction leaning into like speculative fiction. I see it labeled as science fiction, but I think that's incorrect. It is a climate change book. It is set in Florida. And we meet this young family as a hurricane is approaching. And the hurricane brings massive tragedy into their lives. And then we meet this young girl named Wanda, who was born during that hurricane. And we watch her grow up as Florida is essentially like submerged by the sea because climate change is ravaging the planet. And it is beautifully written. It is heartbreaking. It is both like a hard read and a super propulsive, compelling read. Like I both felt like I couldn't put it down and I absolutely wanted to put it down. It was one of those like real tension. Like it was hard to read this because it felt so real. And at the same time, like I had to keep reading because I had to know what happened. So because I was in this reading slump, I was like, I don't want to read distressing literary fiction. That sounds awful. But I think that for me, like the mood was actually like I wanted to feel connected in my reading. And so my mom was reading this book, my aunt was reading this book, everybody at the library is reading this book. And I'm like, okay, well, then I'll read this book. Like actually what I was craving was that ability to talk to some people about the book I was reading who'd already read it, right? Like I started pleasure reading because I wanted to talk about the books I read, but sometimes I want people to talk back at me. So I think my mood was that I was feeling disconnected and I was feeling a bit isolated in my reading. And so I read this book. And by the end, I truly felt like transformed. Like I think that its height, that's what literature does. It transforms us. It changes how we see ourselves, how we see the world. And this book absolutely did that for me. And so I just like highly recommend The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks Dalton.
Also, it has the word pirate in the title. And I love anything to do with pirates. So
Yes. I really would like to know where the title came from because it's not obviously outlined, but it's a beautiful read.
It's funny because as you were talking, you were making me think about the Annihilation trilogy from Jeff Vandermeer, which is also Florida and kind of like supernatural slash question mark speculative fiction. Not sure what's happening. It's not, I would say, as obviously about climate change, but I think the themes of sort of unrestrained, mysterious changes to the world around us are very much there. And I loved those books. I mean, this sounds wonderful. Much more realistic than Jeff Vandermeer.
There is a little bit of a magical realism aspect, but I'd say they're more dystopian than they are supernatural in any way.
I feel like based on the two books that I have talked about so far, it sounds like I only read magical realism. And that's not true, but I do love magical realism, but it's not required. So
yeah, beautiful. Well, I think you'll love this book. And all right, what is your third recommendation?
You know, I think I have to go with something that is not magical realism to prove that I do read some other things. Because you were talking about the mood of wanting a book that would make you feel connected. This was a book, it's We Will Rest, ! The Art of Escape from Tricia Hersey, who is the Nap Bishop, leader of the Nap Ministry, which if you are not aware, do yourself a favor, everyone listening to this, and go look up her wonderful work. She's an artist and a poet, and she is also kind of a social activist, and she has created these nap interventions that are especially aimed at Black women and acknowledging the amount of uncelebrated and unacknowledged labor that Black women do and have always done in our country. And so making space for them to rest. And she has these collective nap events, and she talks about the importance of rest. And I love her work. I am not a Black woman, but I think the way that she talks about not wanting to be swallowed up by hustle culture and grind culture is wonderful. And she wrote, the first book that she published was Rest is Resistance, which was more of a kind of straightforward manifesto, which I also read and also really enjoyed. But this one, We Will Rest, again, also I love that it has so much punctuation. It's We Will Rest, ! The Art of Escape. This one is really like, this one kind of rung a chord with me because it's really all about kind of the trickster energy of finding room to rest and to escape. And it's also beautiful. Like, this book is small. It's beautifully illustrated. It also plays with the font and typography. So it's like, this one I bought. This one was not a library. It was like, I want to own this as an object. And it's more kind of short chapters, some of which are about historical examples of Black people who have found ways to rest and kind of been tricksters. Some of them are kind of motivational, like, here is a thing that you can try, suggested activity. And some of them are just kind of beautifully written observations about rest. And they also talk, I mean, it's not just about like take a nap. It's rest as a larger concept and the idea of doing things collectively so that you don't need to take on all of the work yourself, and kind of finding alternatives in a world that does not encourage alternatives. But I would say the mood of it is very much, I just wanted to feel kind of like there's a way forward in a moment where that is hard to find. And I'm really thinking about that a lot these days, about Krista Tippett, who's the host of On Being. She talks about it as muscular hope, and that hope is sort of a muscular choice. And I feel like Tricia Hersey is a really great example of that. Like, she is actively finding rest and positivity. And I just like needed that.
I love it. I need to get a copy of this. I have read Rest is Resistance, but I didn't even clock that she had a new book. So I'm excited to learn about it.
She also has a really lovely deck of cards, the Rest deck, which I also have.
Gorgeous. We'll link it all in the show notes. Well, my final book, once again, is radically different than what you just talked about. Last weekend, I found myself in like a very specific mood. So I feel like the two moods I talked about before, like, so again, all these books kind of helped me cure a reading slump. Like, I read Problematic Summer Romance because I just needed a sort of smutty, easy to read book that could bring me back into reading when everything sounded bad. And then I read The Light Pirate because I wanted to feel connected to other readers. And that happened to be this community experience. But this past weekend, I had kind of found myself over like the hump of my reading slump. I was like enjoying reading again. And I had a lot of books from the library, but I couldn't pick which one I wanted to read. And I knew we were having this conversation. So I was like, okay, cool. Let me actually think about my mood. Let me like plan in advance. What is the mood and what is the book I want? So when I sat down to think about that, I was like, okay, I want something kind of escapist. Like, I don't want something that's like set in the real world. I don't want to be dealing with like real world issues, quote unquote. I do a lot of that in my reading, in my life, but I wanted a book that wasn't going to do that for the weekend. And then I was like, I would also love a book that is set in the winter because it's hot and I'm not really feeling this humidity right now. So like, can I find a book that is like out of this world and set in the winter? And then I was like, and it also needs to be super plot driven because I was having like a smooth brain weekend. I was not trying to like spend 100 pages feeling into a book. Like I wanted it to drop me in the middle of a story. So I picked up this sci-fi space thriller that I don't even know why it ended up in my library holds. I don't remember who told me about this book, but it was perfectly suited to that mood. And I read through the whole thing in less than 2 days. So that book was Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes, which is a pen name for Stacy Cade, who's written some romance and other things under her given name. In this book, we meet this psychologist, Dr. Ophelia Bray, who is studying this like syndrome that happens with people who live in space. So we're in this world where humans have like terraformed beyond Earth, and some people live on space stations, some people live on different planets, some people still live on Earth, but they like live all over the universe. And this psychologist is studying this like mental illness essentially that like causes people to have a sort of like mental break if they spend too much time in space. And so she is sent to this planet with a research team that has recently suffered a loss. And her job is to like make sure they're all okay so it doesn't escalate into more violence. There's a lot of tension between the crew and her. They find some stuff on the planet that is like very questionable. And it's snowing the whole time because it's super cold. So this was like the perfect plot-driven escapist space winter read for me when I was just like trying to escape summer from my couch. And it's also one of those funny things. I'd love to know if you experienced this. Like, this book was perfect for my mood. So it was like 5 stars in the sense like it's exactly what I wanted at that moment. But do I think it's like a 5-star read writ large? Like, do I think I would recommend it to anyone and everyone, or it's like an amazing work of literature? Like, no. But it was just so perfect for what I needed in that moment. And that's what I love about mood reading the most.
I agree. And I think of a 5-star read as I really loved this, and it's something that I will keep thinking about when I'm done. And so I like that you're bringing up that difference because I agree. Sometimes it's like the totally immersive, like winter in space from your hot couch is like, that's exactly the right thing and you super enjoy it. Like, am I going to keep thinking about that long term? I don't know. But yeah, you're making me doubt again. Like maybe I should be including that in 5 stars.
Yeah, I think my like most controversial take about star systems is like there's like 1 star, 5 star, and then just muck in between. Like either the book was extraordinary, it was awful, or it like fell into a range of like good enough that I finished it. Maybe I even really liked it, but it will never elevate to like this 5-star level. And I want to be more generous with my ratings, but also be honest about how many books can really stick with me. I think it's so subjective. It's very rare that I will say something like this book was bad. And there are some books that have been published that I think are just straight up bad. But more often than not, I try to couch it in just a sort of like, it wasn't my mood or it's not a topic for me.
I would say those tend to be the books that I just won't finish. Like if I start it and I'm like, this is not for me or this is bad, that's when I'll put a book down. I have no qualms about putting a book down. I don't feel like I can like add it to my, Storygraph or Goodreads or, although Storygraph has a did not finish option, which I appreciate. But I feel like my problem is when it comes to rating, like if it's a 1-star book, I'll just stop reading it. Like, I'm not going to finish a book that I would rate 1 star.
This has been really hard for me. I am a completionist by nature in a funny sort of way. And so quitting a book historically was something I never did. But now that I read so much more, like now that I'm averaging 2 or 3 books a week, I feel like I just don't have time to finish books I'm not enjoying. And that said, I do track the ones I don't finish because on a few occasions, I have forgotten that I started and purposely didn't finish a book and then started it again and then been annoyed that I did it twice. So I like to keep track of which ones I put down.
That's a smart idea. I definitely will stop a book if I am getting angry while I read it. Like angry at the book. Like whether that's like it's bad writing or the content is not content that I'm responding to. And I recognize all of these things are subjective. I'm a real snob about like the quality of the writing, and that is entirely subjective. And so sometimes I will pick up a book that other people have said this was great. And I'm like, don't like the writing. Sorry. I have to say, before I forget, that if you liked, it was Ghost Station, right? Natasha Pulley wrote a book on Mars that you might like.
Hell yeah, hell yeah.
It's called The Mars House. It was I think her last book. And it includes some like snow and mammoths and cold. So you could save it for a summertime read. It's like not totally smooth brain, but it was much more like there was not like learning about ancient Greece involved. It's like they're on Mars and it's more about like different people. It's like in the future and they're depending on whether they were raised on Earth and then like moved to Mars or whether they were natively born on Mars. Their gravity and weight is hugely different. And so it creates this kind of class system based on how much mass your body has. And like, it was an interesting reflection on kind of the different ways that we classify people and the different ways that we make judgments based on people's bodies, but kind of using a very different metric. It's like, how dense are your bones?
Wild. Bone density as a sorting mechanism for wow. Okay. Blowing my mind. That sounds fascinating. Okay, Rachel, my final question for you is maybe 3 questions. So I'm curious, like, how you have found some of your favorite books, these ones you told us about today or otherwise, and how you like keep track of books you want to read when you maybe are sort of like getting recommendations from a lot of places.
Yeah, it's funny because I've never really turned to social media for book recommendations. I mean, I think because I grew up reading before the internet, so I got used to finding books before the internet. I will say now some of the places I listen to a ton of podcasts and a number of them. I don't listen to any that are specifically about books except for NPR's Book of the Day. And that is one place that I find book recs sometimes. It's basically like it comes out every weekday and it's like 5 to 7 minutes, some NPR conversation with an author that probably aired on, some other NPR show and they just excerpt that conversation. So that one has been nice. And there are a few other places where they may occasionally review a book as part of, being a podcast that is about larger pop culture. And so sometimes I will listen to those because I'm listening to those podcasts because I like the people and the vibe that they are bringing. And so I tend to trust their book recommendations. I also get a couple of email subscriptions that are specifically about books. Like the New York Times has a Read Like the Wind email that comes out once a week. And that's really nice for books that are older. Like it's not so much focused on newly published books. And then there's a really fun Substack newsletter called What to Read If. Elizabeth Held is the woman who runs it. And she has they're always really fun titles that are like very specific moods. She has, I pulled a couple of fun ones recently. It was like, What to Read If You Loved the Met Gala Theme. Like What to Read If You've Had a Big Night Out Go Awry. They're always, I think she's kind of like retroactively applying the mood, but they're really fun. And it's like very omnivorous and all over the place. So a couple of things like that. And I honestly, I just have some friends who I ask them about reading, like other friends that I know who read a lot.
And do you add all these books to a Goodreads TBR or something?
Yeah, I use Goodreads and Storygraph. And so I will go and add a book that I want to read to both of those places, pretty immediately. And then, should a time come when there are no library holds in the queue, I will kind of go back and check that. I also have every August, I go up to Northern Maine for basically a reading vacation. It's like my parents have rented a house in Northern Maine for 20 plus years, and we've done all the things that there are to do. And I just bring a whole bunch of books and sit and read them. So that is often a place where I go and mine the TBR. Yeah, but it's kind of organic.
Yeah, I think all of this makes so much sense. I can relate to a lot of the ways you find books and save them. Like, I am definitely a podcast listener. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters about books, and I love to talk to my friends who read a lot. I just think that like other people are the best source. And also, when I go to the library, I peruse like all the tables and I will regularly kind of pick up a book that like the librarians have put on the table to recommend, or I'll go to my local bookstore and find things there as well. And when I see a book I like, typically the first thing I do is try to find it in my library holds. I prefer reading physically, so I'll use my actual local library app and see if I can put it on hold. And if it's not there, then I'll like add it to my list and Storygraph or something like that.
That's basically the exact process that I use. I love browsing a bookstore and adding things to my TBR.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Pleasure Reading, Rachel. I really appreciate that you tune into the show. I'm grateful you joined me to talk about mood reading and brought us a list of some of your favorite books and the moods that they suit. For listeners, you can find all of the books we talked about today in the show notes. Those links will take you to Rachel's bookshop page, where if you make a purchase, she'll receive a small thank you for the book rec. And otherwise, there will be more episodes of Pleasure Reading coming soon. I am through my reading slump and can't wait to start making some new lists for all of us. So until next time, here's to your next best book.